Josh and Frankie. What a couple of dumb shits. Hello, primates! You found Primus Tracks. Congratulations! I am Josh. He is on the 38th floor of Primus Tracks Towers, and he's floating. It's Frankie.
Hi, Josh.
How's the view up there from your sensory deprivation tank today, Frankie?
It is fabulous.
Yeah,
because I can imagine that I am at an Oysterhead show.
So you get in the tank, it's dark and soundproof, and you float in the thin layer of water, and you think about Oysterhead.
Yes.
Some people would plumb the depths of human consciousness. Frankie relives live shows in his head. I guess if I got in a sensory deprivation tank, all you'd hear is, welcome, primates, primatrons, and everyone in between. Today we are talking about Oz is Ever Floating, Track 2 from Oysterhead's The Grand Pecking Order. We have a lot of business to take care of before we talk Oysterhead today, Frankie. Of course, you can find us at Primus Tracks on Instagram and Threads. PrimusTracksPod@gmail.com is the email address. And if you have a question for Tim Soya, call or text 337-514-7692. I think we have another episode in the offing there, Frankie, for asking Soya, but it might be a bit. Of course, you can support the podcast. Easiest way to do that, spread the word. Let those ads at the end roll. You can also, of course, avail yourself of some stickers. Send us a DM or an email about that, and I'll take care of it. And there's patreon.com/Primus Tracks for more of us, as if you needed that in your lives. Frankie, before we talk about Oz is Ever Floating, you've got some miscellaneous debris.
Okay, Josh, so you probably recall how back in 2013, Stealing the Seas of Cheese was reissued. It was given the deluxe treatment. So we got both the CD edition plus DVD or plus Blu-ray, whatever was your choice, and it was also reissued on vinyl.
I think I have every format of that. I'm pretty sure.
Great. The most valuable format would be the yellow pressing, which was randomly distributed around the world.
Correct.
And limited to only 1,000 copies. Now, the value on that version has increased quite considerably. It has become a relatively rare piece of vinyl nowadays. So I was doing some reading over at Discogs, and I stumbled across this really fantastic review of the record from a guy who shared an anecdote that runs for about 6 paragraphs, and he goes into detail about how he obtained the record. So apparently, he went into a record store that was going out of business, and he said that it was total chaos. Customers were removing records from the shrink wrap in order to find the colored limited editions, such as this one. And this guy had previously bought multiple copies of Seas of Cheese, and all of them were black. So he thought he might as well give it a shot. He unwrapped one of the copies at the record store, and lo and behold, he stumbled upon the yellow version of Seas of Cheese. Now, mind you, so far it sounds great. The problem is that there was another guy digging through records there, and he began to fight him for the record.
What is this, a Tickle Me Elmo? Come on!
Yeah. He said that he was about to explore the area where he took the record from, so according to this guy's logic, he practically took the record out of his hands, and he was demanding the guy to give it to him. He said no, and then the other guy started clenching his teeth, his face got red, and he got out of the record store. A few minutes later, his mother comes into the record store yelling, "Who is the guy who took the record out of my son's hands?" Absolutely insane. I will not tell you the conclusion. Go search for that anecdote at Discogs. It runs for 6 paragraphs. It is brilliant. It is totally immersive. I felt like I was there watching the whole thing unfold. And you know what is the craziest thing, Josh?
Well, so far it'd be a guy getting his mommy for conflict over a Primus record.
Even crazier than that, our beloved and legendary Travis in Alaska replied to the anecdote under the post.
Wow, Travis is inserting himself into what is turning into some kind of family feud. Hatfields and McCoys.
Yes.
Man. Careful, Travis. Goodness. People really value those records.
Imagine what would happen if somebody stumbled into a dirt cheap copy of the Grand Pecking Order in a record store or something like that. I can only imagine the chaos that would ensue.
I wouldn't even care about the record. I'd just whip my phone out and get 1 million hits on YouTube. Everybody would be happy then. I do have to correct you on one piece of information, Frankie. You said the yellow vinyl randomly inserted into sleeves of the 2013 Seas of Cheese is an edition of 1000. I have to correct you. It's actually 1001 because I opened mine and got the black vinyl and then immediately grabbed the yellow spray paint and made the 1001st. Sold that son of a bitch for $300.
That's a great idea.
I'm kidding. I didn't actually do any of that. But it would have been a stroke of genius and a stroke of fraud had I sold it. Thank you for that, Frankie. Now I get some light reading. One of the greatest short stories of the 21st century is awaiting me on Discogs. It is a wonderful commentary on consumerism, I'm sure. Until I get a chance to go to Discogs, we're stuck talking about Oz Is Ever Floating. Track 2 from the Grand Pecking Order, Oysterhead's Alone studio record from the year 2001. Credits on this one, Frankie. It's a brisk 2 minutes and 49 seconds. Music by Oysterhead, lyrics by Claypool and Anastasio.
Premiered on October 21st, 2001 in Seattle, Washington. Always jammed and extended during live performances. Mind you, sometimes it wouldn't run so much over the studio recording, but we're talking about Oysterhead, so of course they were not going to play the song as per the studio version.
Right.
The song refers to the record's sound engineer and producer, Oz Fritz, whom used to tell the band about his interest in Dr. John C. Lilly and his work with development of isolation tanks. He used the tanks as a way to explore consciousness, and later he developed experiments with LSD and psychedelics. The band performed the song on November 5th, 2001, at the late night with Conan O'Brien, marking their only television appearance to date. Please note that Dr. John C. Lilly passed away a couple of days prior to the release of the album in October 2001.
I have a note on that, actually. If we go to the Over the Electric Grapevine book by Greg Prado, page 266, Dave Lefkowitz says, this I'm quoting Lefkowitz, he was actually able to play the final recording of that song for John C. Lilly before he died. Interesting.
Oh, that's brilliant.
So they must have been able to rush it over to him so he could hear his name in song shortly before it was his time to ascend to a different plane, I guess, is the way to state it.
I forgot completely about that entry in the book. He did get to hear the track. That's wonderful.
No word on his reaction, although I hope it was positive.
It is as mysterious as Ulrico's reaction to the Desaturating 7. We know he heard it. We have no idea what he thought about it.
Right. Well, if it's anything like Roger Waters' reaction to Live Frog Set 2, it's better left unsaid. Although that does beg the question, when somebody, musicians of a certain level, I mean, Claypool, Copeland, and Anastasio are more or less recognizable to some music fans. But when guys of their level pay homage or tribute to someone else, it does make you wonder, because that's their heroes or people that they admire or think are worthy of writing lyrics about. And so it kind of puts, a Claypool or an Anastasio in a weirdly vulnerable position that they usually find themselves on the other side of with fans. So that is something to consider taking on these kind of pursuits. A little bit more about Oz and John as well, Frankie. Oz Fritz is a longtime sound engineer, engineered or been behind the console for recordings by, ready, Bootsy Collins, Bernie Worrell, lots of Bill Laswell projects such as Praxis, some John Zorn records, Buckethead, Turbulence Chest, which is, of course, is the DJ disc release with Les and Bucket and Brain and you name it. Tom Waits, he also engineered portions of Antipop and the Kehoe Nation record, Music for Livers, which is pretty cool, and of course Oysterhead. And there are a lot more recordings that bear his name. And Oz seems to have taken on, as you stated, he seems to have taken on the metaphysical side of John C. Lilly's work. Oz maintains a pretty thorough blog and video blog in which he tells you about all kinds of convoluted and Byzantine metaphysical things, of which I really have no concept, Frankie. This is something I've never really investigated, but it, to me, in my casual observations of it, it borders on incomprehensible, because once again, we're talking about human constructs for something that we can't really explain, and a lot of them are so structured that they defy scientific explanation. And so it's largely experience-based, and as we know, experience and perspective are subjective. So there are, but despite the belief of some kind of collective unconscious that we all share. Now, once again, this is going way out into this territory that I don't really understand, and I honestly don't have much of an interest in. And part of that, Frankie, is because I live near a little town called Ashland, Oregon, and there is a pretty large spiritual, metaphysical community there. And one of the first things I learned when I moved to this area is that people referred to Ashland as 5 square miles surrounded by reality. It's a pretty good joke, but at the same time, it kind of gives you an idea of some of the clientele there. And now this is completely separate from anything that Oz would probably be into or subscribe to. However, if you walk in downtown Ashland, Oregon, Frankie, you go by a storefront and it's named Haven. And it is the storefront / welcoming hall for a cult. And they are a cult, and it's called Twin Ray. And it's these two people who have, I guess, been touched by the light, and they're going to help you on your journey to unleash your inner light, as it were. And of course, it's going to cost you dearly financially to do that. And they're obviously both hacks and cranks and are just in it as a racket. And it's strangely popular. Blech. Not a fan.
In order for them to actually feel inspired to make the song, I'm guessing that what Oz shared with Les and company must have made a considerable impression in them, right?
Yeah, and Oz was clearly sticking to the idea of this sensory deprivation as a way to explore human consciousness and its limitless potential, I suppose. And that goes to the works of John C. Lilly. So Oz really into that. And Lilly is a fascinating figure. I don't know if you read up on him, Frankie, but I did kind of on a surface level. But he was a psychoanalyst. He worked with electricity and the brain. There's actually a certain kind of wave named after him that's actually still used in a different capacity to this day. But he also, later on in life, got into experimenting with LSD and other drugs and as a way to unlock the human consciousness. But he also did really in-depth, I suppose pun intended, research on communication with dolphins and published a lot of papers about that. And there's some fascinating stuff there about his work with dolphins. But the sensory deprivation tanks that he pioneered, probably his most popular or well-known legacy, in which, as stated earlier, you're in a soundproof tank in a little bit of water, and it's dark, and actually nobody can hear you. So I'm going to stop that because nobody would hear you while you're in the tank. But the whole point was to isolate the mind from any external stimulus, so that the mind could go where it goes. And nowadays a lot of people use these deprivation tanks for meditation. Some people use it for trying to expand their consciousness, what have you. It's actually become pretty popular with a lot of pro athletes in this country. They will use it to help visualize success or visualize their goals or simply de-stress. And there's research around the positive effects that these deprivation tanks or use of them have on stress levels in humans. So at the very least, it has that application. It's kind of hard to quantify some of those other metaphysical properties, but hey, if it's relieving stress, sign me up. The good news, Frankie, is you can get in this tank and you can learn a thing or two about yourself with or without drugs. Or, in your case, 6 liters of American Coca-Cola?
Fantastic.
You don't want to slug that much before getting into the tank. And of course, now I'm thinking about that Simpsons episode where they're in the sensory deprivation
I was
tanks.
thinking about that as well.
And then Homer gets strapped to the truck and he's getting banged around and he goes, hey, sensory deprivation kicks ass. Oh man, I hadn't thought about that in years until this very moment. But Lilly got to hear the final version of this tune in his last days. Hopefully that was not a contributor to his demise.
It's curious, Josh, how his name adapted so well to the flow of the lyrics.
And that had to be a consideration because it's a little bit easier to adapt Oz, a nice one-syllable name. But John C. Lilly, I guess they had to find that sing-songy quality to John C. Lilly, which
that's
rolls pretty nicely, actually.
That's quite an achievement.
There's a lot of ways you could sing that name. Because it's on the record, it just seems to be the right way to sing that name.
What works really well, before we go into the lyrics, I think what works really well in terms of the layers of the track is how Trey is singing something and Liz is vocalizing or harmonizing something different, which complements perfectly what Trey is singing.
Talked about that a little last time, too, on Little Faces, that on this effort in which you have 2 experienced vocalists, they're both going to contribute, and they're going to contribute to their strengths. You see that in Little Faces, and you see that even more here in Oz. Les is kind of doing a mono note. Are you? And by the way, I used to annoy a guy in my dormitory. I would run by his dorm room in college and just go, are you still floating, Dr. John C. Lilly? And if he was in there, he would leap out of the room and tackle me to try to get me to stop. So those are pleasant memories. But then you have Trey singing in a different rhythm and delivering different lyrics. And so it's got these two vocal efforts that are layering on top of one another, as you said. And it's really inviting. And to me, that's the hallmark of a power pop song. And that's what I'm calling this tune. It's a power pop tune, from Oysterhead, which is not a descriptor I would normally use with anything related, to Les Claypool. But in this case, I'm using it. And one of the reasons is their use of vocals and how they layer them. A couple other things that make it a power pop tune to me, that Stuart Copeland drum beat, killer. And I know we're going to listen to some live tunes later, but when they ratchet up the tempo on this one, it sounds fantastic. Some of the other tunes... Why don't we
sample the song?
So let's hear that opening groove, courtesy of Stuart Copeland. Couple other things they're doing here in these first 19 seconds is presaging what's to come, because that line Trey just played comes back with the vocal line, are you still floating, right? And Stuart's giving us this drum groove. Les is laying down that foundation that makes up the bulk of his bass part. And the other thing I'm going to note, Frankie, because we're going to listen to some live cuts, this is, coming back to the studio cut, this is positively pokey. It's like they're taking their sweet time with it.
Yeah.
Because I feel like, especially that Conan O'Brien performance that you referenced, they're moving, and it sounds really good at that tempo. So to come back to this one, it's a little slow, but it also allows me to really hear it with more open ears because they're not ripping through it.
And because it's slower, the slight change of tempo that we're going to sample makes it all the more compelling.
Yeah. So we had our intro, and then at about I'm going to resume at about 1 minute and 10 seconds after we get a couple of verses and a guitar break. We get this. The hook. There's that hook with the dual vocals. There's a lot of neat little things in this tune, but that part that you time-coded for us, Frankie, with that change in Les's bass line, which is a very less bass line still. Oh, really cool. It's a cool change. And it just changes the feel as well underneath what Trey's playing there. I
want to point out that the production on the album is fantastic. That sample that you play right now, it completely filled my headphones. I mean, it's incredible how 3 guys could make such a wall of sound. It's incredibly compelling.
They do it without brick walling it, I guess, because the production is clear.
It's an audiophile record. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and listening to it on nice cans, as I am right now, it really does fill my ears without being overbearing. And we do have 2 or 3 guitar tracks that Trey is putting down on this. I think there's the single bass track, and then of course the drums are mixed really nicely too, and it's that crisp Stuart Copeland snare as well. That triplet, dig-a-dot, back into the hook always gets me too. I just love the snap on that. You're going to hear me say the word crisp every single track on this record. Assuming Stuart Copeland hits a snare on that track, you're going to hear me call it crisp. So this one really has these great elements, once again, of power pop. I do have a couple of spots that kind of irk me to a degree, because the song does, it starts in pieces and then really gets going. And then there's actually a part, not too long after where I just paused it, where Trey to me almost sounds indecisive in this part. And that's kind of my main, just kind of my main bugaboo is there's parts, maybe this is just my main issue with not just Fish, but a lot of bands. They just kind of sound too noodly sometimes. Now, granted, Frankie, Larry Lalonde plays some of the weirdest stuff you're ever going to hear, right? But he commits to it, okay? He makes those honking sounds, and he makes the honking sound. But I'm going to play a few seconds here where it just sounds a little too noodly for my taste, or just a little indecisive with the absolute cool groove that Les and Stu are giving us. And maybe it's just my ears, or maybe it's just my bias showing. In the woods of Dr. John C. Lilly. I don't know. I think there's an opportunity there, and I know they're going for groove. And Lalo, when we talked to Lalo last time, he said, they're not trying to impress each other. Nobody's shredding for the most part. They're just making good music. But I just felt like there was a weird blank spot there that needed to be filled with something a bit more authoritative. That's a very minor complaint. I should talk about the bass. Les lays a really cool foundation, and it's that textbook thump and pluck, and we get a few nice fills in there with that classic, I don't even know how to vocalize it, or something like that. And then that part that we played earlier with that descending bass line is wonderful. So we're getting some really nice Les grooves to go with what Stuart's doing. But speaking of Stuart, to me, Frankie, the drums are the highlight. It's that neat groove at the start, and he is so precise. We've talked about that with Tim Alexander. And then to compare it to a bunch of other drummers that we've been speaking of over the years, Brain, Jay Lane, Tim Alexander, of course, and then to bring Stuart Copeland into the picture, it just seems like he's on another level. And that, once again, could be due to reputation that he brings to the table. But man, his precision and his sound are just so on point.
Absolutely unique.
Indeed. I'm actually going to play a few seconds from the Oysterhead performance on Conan O'Brien because of the up-tempo nature of it and because Stewart is undaunted by that. It just sounds like it should be played at this tempo. Also, it sounds like garbage because it's a guy's VHS rip. Sorry to spoil it for anybody. Once again, I'm a layman, but that just sounds like wonderful drumming to me.
Well, now that you mention it, Josh, I just realized that one thing that is a testament that speaks to the uniqueness of this project in terms of what each player brings to the table is the fact that, if you think about it, the last Frog Brigade tour showed us that everything is fair game for Frog Brigade in terms of the Les Claypool catalog. Mm-hmm. They were doing things from all over his career. Primus is a different animal, of course, because they rarely incorporate outside elements. We know there are some exceptions, like Les incorporating Wamola into some drum solos, but for the most part, Primus is about a certain degree of purity, right?
Yeah.
But with his other projects, Les explores pretty much everything he's done. The Fancy Band played things from throughout his career. Same with Delirium, same with Frog Brigade. But if you think about it, Les has never done Oysterhead outside of Oysterhead. He has never tackled any of these songs with another band.
I think that speaks to the musicianship on display there, and that this is their thing. But also, and it's special, of course, because it's two guys he really admires. I think also it has to do with the cohesion. This is not what you would think of when you think of a Les Claypool song. He's not playing lead bass, and while he is one of the three songwriters, he's one of three songwriters. And
exactly.
the other two voices are just as strong as his. They are all asserting themselves, to different degrees throughout the record. But on this one, the cohesion is what I really appreciate about it. And that's kind of why I'm calling it a power pop tune, because it has all three of them playing to strengths, but nobody is clearly the leader of the tune. We're going to hear a couple other tunes where it's pretty obvious who's captaining the ship. But this time, it's clearly all three of them together, and I think those are the tracks that are the strongest on the record. Highlights for you, as far as the musicianship goes?
I would highlight the cohesion, as you said. Everyone is equally important in the track. But what I would highlight about the track in particular is that it's one of the shortest on the album. I mean, the Grand Pecking Order and Owner of the World are not that long, but there is something about the quality of Ozzy's Overfloating in terms of its structure and its delivery that makes it fly by. It's over before you even realize it. Whereas there are other songs on the album, like Rubberneck Lions, for instance, that they do have sections which stretch out and set a mood. And Ozzy's Overfloating, like you mentioned, something cool begins, and as soon as it began, it's done. And the track is over. So it doesn't even give you the chance to settle in. It just passes you by, and we're already on the title track.
Yeah, I think that brevity is a strength here to this tune. If this one was 5 minutes and 48 seconds long, I don't know that I would enjoy it as much, because they show up, they kick its ass, and they leave to the next track, and that's great. As evidenced by that Conan performance, I remember watching that on the night that they actually appeared on Conan, and it was great. Sounded fantastic. Other than, of course, and you may have noticed this, every time Lesser Primus goes on a talk show to play, they always screw up Les's bass sound. I guess it's hard to hear really rich bass over broadcast TV anyway. At least then. Let's talk about these lyrics, Frankie. We hinted at it earlier. We've talked about it to a degree. These lyrics are interesting to me for two reasons, Frankie. One, we have discussed the background with Oz and John Lilly. The second reason is the unusual but satisfying lyrical structure. The syntax holds, right? The words are placed in a meaningful pattern that we can actually create meaning from. However, they're interrupting their own sentences with the cadence of the lyrics. Because this is all one sentence. Oz is always floating, ever drifting, sometimes doting over things that mean the world to Dr. John C. Lilly. That's one sentence, and it's grammatically correct. Of course, you have to, if you're going to write it as prose, you're going to need some pretty fancy punctuation to hold it all together. When it's delivered lyrically, unlike Little Faces, which you observed last time, translates pretty well to a poetry reading, this one doesn't really have that same verve when read outside of the music, because the rhythm of the vocal delivery, Oz is always floating, ever drifting, sometimes doting over things. It's a little more sing-songy, and it just doesn't transfer without the music. But I just love that it's the sometimes doting over things. There's that pause in the lyrical delivery, right? So they're kind of interrupting themselves mid-sentence, but that's all one sentence. And then the way they hang on John C. Lilly is pretty great. So that's the structure. So the next verse, in the tank he's grooving, ever sifting, sometimes smoothing out the things that mean the world to Dr. John C. Lilly. So smoothing out, doting over, they're interrupting themselves, but they're keeping the AA rhyme scheme, and then that enjambed line that ends Dr. John C. Lilly. And then, of course, my favorite part, that question. I don't think that they were teasing Oz. I just think they were fascinated by what he had to say. But noting that John Lilly was a pioneer of this, I love that question. The question I would run down the hall to try to bug Dave with. Are you still floating, Dr. John C. Lilly? So all of these things, by the way, are happening in the deprivation tank. Oz is floating in the deprivation tank, Frankie, and he's letting his mind drift, but he's also thinking about the purpose of it, established by John C. Lilly. It's funny that they say things that mean the world to Dr. John C. Lilly. So this is something that he championed. Across the inner cosmos, he is flying, as in inside his mind. His tank is isolating. In his mind, he's elevating. And that's an interesting lyric. In his mind, he's elevating. So does that mean he's achieving a higher plane or state of being in his mind? Or does that mean he thinks he is? There could be a double entendre.
According to his research, there were several limits that the human mind could transcend, but he was very aware that there were limits that the body could never transcend.
Right. And so there could be a double entendre there of in his mind he's elevating. Is he reaching those limits, or does he just think he is? And that's where perception comes into play, and so on and so forth. And we don't have to get into it, but it's something to think about. And
it is quite an interesting topic.
At least as far as the sensory deprivation goes, what can you actually achieve in there? And it's going to be up to the person and the mindset that they bring, and are they dropping acid before they get in there? All are variables that will come into play. I really like the last line that comes over the "Are you still floating?" which is, in the liquid he will lie, rehearsing for the final act of dying.
I wonder what you thought about the lyric.
When you're lying in one of these tanks with absolutely no senses to rely on, I suppose it is very much like being entombed and interred, I suppose, other than the fact that you're conscious to a degree. I did wonder about that couplet because it's as a rehearsal for dying. Interesting.
I did some reading about consciousness a few years back, Josh, and I discovered several interesting things. I don't know if they could appeal to you, but because, I mean, some of this stuff becomes deeply philosophical, but on very basic terms, consciousness could be defined as the state of being awake and aware of your surroundings, the awareness of perception or something by a person, or the fact of awareness by the mind of itself and the world. And then we go into subcategories like self-awareness, sensory experience, practical consciousness, reflective consciousness, and reflexive consciousness. And each of these categories have quite an amazing amount of research that has been dedicated to them. And then we have these tangents that are really fascinating to discuss connected to consciousness, such as the Mandela effect. Have you ever heard about that?
Oh, sure, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's mind-blowing when people ask you, did the Monopoly guy wear a monocle? And you say, of course he did. And then you discover that he never did.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot of examples of that out there. The Berenstain Bears, and of course, Nelson Mandela himself.
One that comes to my mind is, I guess I was a victim of that effect because for many years of my life, I did have a clear memory of Mike Tyson biting the other guy's ear off, or at least a considerable portion of the ear during the fight, and then spitting it. And I recall the blood on the floor. And then when I read up on the incident, you discover that he didn't really bite anything off the guy. There was no blood involved. I mean, he did bite his ear, but he didn't tear it off. Or at least it was a really minimal portion which was actually damaged. So you do question, where do all of those memories come from?
It's a mystery, isn't it? How do people, how does one group of people remember, Sinbad being a genie in a movie or what the hell it was? Yeah. And how does another group of people go, no, that never happened? It is a strange thing. And I don't know how it gets planted in a collective of people, but it does. And yeah, there is a lot of great research into it. There's a lot of great theorizing about it. You can certainly go down a rabbit hole or 20 in this field, and you could get lost in it for sure. And then you end up, at in a cult. Please consult me before joining a weird religious order where all they care about is a tax write-off, Frankie. Please.
Sure.
Okay. I was trying to dabble in philosophy as a younger man. It didn't necessarily speak to me, although I still do find it an interesting topic.
It is pretty inescapable. It actually finds its way into every single topic that you can think of, even in terms of space research, which is something that we commonly associate with strictly facts. And, it's just data. But then you discover that there's a point in space research where things become so complex that the philosophical element needs to come into the question, because science has a limit as to how much it can explain something. So the topic becomes even more complex. I find philosophy really, really quite an engaging topic.
A lot of what you would read from 200, 300 years ago, some of that has been addressed by science, but a lot of it has not, because the nature of the unconscious is yet to be determined. We are bludgeoned with theory from all kinds of angles, and it's just up to the reader to determine what makes the most sense to them or what they're buying. If you would like a guide to eternal salvation, all you have to do is email primustrackspod@gmail.com with the subject line, Eternal Salvation, and I will send you an invoice for an inordinate amount of money. All you have to do is pay that invoice, and eternal salvation will be yours. And you might receive a deprivation tank in the mail, cash on delivery. My promise to you. Let's hear a live cut, shall we?
This is Broomfield in Denver, Valentine's Day 2020, what would be the first of a 2-night run, which was a huge deal because it was the first Oysterhead performance in years. This is a official soundboard, which is for sale at the Fish store. And let's hear how this song sounded after these guys got together for the first time since Bonnaroo 2006.
That electronic loop is getting me because at first I thought it was the crowd going, woo! But it's not. Sounds largely the same. Stewart's getting into it. They're grooving.
Pretty cohesive.
They dialed back the tempo a little bit. It's not quite record speed. It's a little bit faster, but it's not breakneck. Let's forward to some jamming. You know what I was expecting at the end of that series of bars was a but we didn't get it. They kept going. What I appreciate about that part is Treya's playing decisively and it's moving things. So that's acceptable.
And it's fully improvisational.
Yeah, and those guys are really locked into each other there. Stewart lets the bottom drop out and they all pick right back up. I think they're listening to Stu there for some of their cues. More so than normally the band listens to Les, but it sounds like they were listening to Stewart there. That sounded pretty cool. Yeah. Wow. Nice live cut. That is one I had not heard. I've actually heard very few Oysterhead live cuts over the years. But that one from 2020 sounds good.
And the feels that Stewart makes with the toms are fantastic.
The fills give me the feels.
Yeah.
Let's hear some Primates takes on this here track. If you would like your take read on this here podcast, head over to patreon.com/Primus Tracks. One of the many ways in which you can participate in the podcast is leaving your Primates takes over there. I post a thread about a week ahead of time, gives you some lead time to get in there and get your thoughts down, and we'll read them right here. For example, Jordan Kahn says, Oz is perhaps the best track on an album full of bangers. He says, I saw Oz open 2 shows and close another in 2001. It feels more or less based on subject matter. John Lilly has a kinship with Jack Parsons, and that's not the only reason this should be from the Claypool Anastasio Delirium. That's pretty funny. And he says, here, adding an extraordinarily melodic element brings out Les's best. Anthony Del Prete adds, this song kind of grooves along for me. Vocals are actually the highlight, and Les's bass thunder. I always thought it was a great second track for the album for some reason. It just always seems to fit right there, and it's definitely a bit different from the rest of the album. But then again, I feel that a lot of this album is different from the rest of the album.
Good point.
That's nice and spooky. There's your metaphysical right there, Frankie. David Fraser Crane is back in the fold, and he said it's one of my favorite tracks on the album. In early 2000s, during the Primus hiatus, I was resistant to any other projects that Les was involved in. Thankfully, this song and others on the album opened my mind to decades of music from Les. Can't wait for the vinyl release. Very funny, David. It's never going to happen. Trish asks, I could notice it more on the Conan recording, but does anyone know what the theremin sounding instrument that's producing the Wii U is? I'm guessing it's just an electronic loop. Trish went on to say, I read the first 7 tracks of this album sync up to The Wizard of Oz, and I need to check the validity of that. She came back a day or two later and says, I took one for the team and watched The Wizard of Oz synced with Grand Pecking Order. And I mean, sure, maybe if I were higher than giraffe balls, it would seem to work. Like, dude, they said, here comes Mr. Oysterhead, and it's when you meet Professor Marvel. It's all connected, man. Nice, Trish. That's it for our Primates takes on Oz is Ever Floating. Now, we're only on the second track, Frankie, but where does this one rank for you overall on a record that we've barely just begun with?
Wow, tough question. It's the kind of song that I thoroughly enjoy in the context of the record. I rarely listen to it outside of that context. It's not on any of my playlists, which does not mean that I don't like it. I love it. Mm-hmm. I think it's a fantastic song, but I rarely extract it from the context of listening to the album back to back. I just think it works great there as the second track, as it was mentioned before. Excellent song in the grand scheme of things of the album, but not the kind of song that I reach out for randomly. And that happens to me with a lot of Les Claypool and Primus tracks.
You missed a golden opportunity there, pal.
Which one?
To say an excellent track in the grand pecking order of the album.
Oh, yes, of course.
I can say this, Frankie. Oz, let me out now! You've been trapped! Next time, Frankie, there's a new sensation hitting town.
When all else has been done and said, we're about to tackle my favorite song on the record.
Later days.
Willie Mays.
Oz is ever floating.